Okay, we are live. Welcome to Boston Basic Income. I'm Alex Howlett. So today we're talking about a 1986 article by Robert J. Vanderdeen and Philippe von Parijs called A Capitalist Road to Communism. Okay, so 1986 was an auspicious year for basic income because that was the year that the Basic Income Earth Network formed. So that's it's a network of people who think about basic income and talk about basic income. It was originally the Basic Income Europe network, and then in 2004, I think they expanded it to all of Earth, letting the rest of us in.
They didn't want to change the acronym. Probably.
Yeah. So Philippe von Parijs is one of the kind of probably the primary modern, kind of godfather of basic income, and he did this article in 1986. I actually didn't read this article until recently, but Van Parijs was the person who introduced me to the term basic income. I learned about it from something else he had written. So I've read a bunch of his other stuff. He wrote a book in 2017 with another guy, Yannick van der Boort, called Basic Income. So he's very much involved with basic income in the modern sense that we talk about it today. I think he gets a lot of stuff right. He defines basic income in exactly the way we define it now. He doesn't define it particularly in this article because this is very early. The term basic income, I think, only comes up once in the entire article, but he's talking about basic income. And there are some things he gets right, some important insights, and there are some things that I also think he gets wrong. So we'll get into that too. So it's called A Capitalist Road to Communism. And the basic idea in this article is that if we want to achieve communism, which they define to be everyone gets the benefits of society, of the social product of the economy, irrespective of their labor. So that's kind of a little bit how they define it. They also say from each according to his ability, to each according to his needs, and some of the more typical Marxist stuff. But I like that they at least call attention to this idea of separating labor from income or from benefit in the economy. Before we get started, I've got a few quotes from the article that we can talk about. This is yours, by the way. So I've got a few quotes from the articles we could talk about, but we'll start by going around the room and get people's initial thoughts on basic income, whether it makes sense to think of it as something we could use to transition from capitalism into communism without going through socialism. So in this article, they're saying capitalism is maybe a better way to get to communism than socialism is.
I guess I'm just open to learning more from the article, because usually the way that I think about basic income is kind of in between. It's neither really fully what we think of as, I guess, capitalism or communism, because I think of it, like you talk about it, as funding the free market in a way. So I think of a free market still operating actually maybe even more efficiently to produce the benefit. So I don't know if that's compatible with this or not. But I also think, like you said, of people getting a benefit, the basic income, that isn't tied to their contribution. So maybe that's more what he means. But I'm kind of interested to see what he means and what he has in mind about how things would look with the basic income.
I really liked I only got through about half of it, but I read a different version of it, or something of the same argument in the book. And I like it. It's surprisingly kind of out of the box. It's like a fresh way of talking about these things to my ears.
I haven't read the article, I have to admit, but I'm intrigued by the idea that there could be a capitalist road to communism. I mean, I think of capitalism as very different, the aims being very different. And like Bethany, I think of basic income being more tied to capitalism than communism. But the social good from basic income sort of fits in between there. But in terms of how the economy works, I can't see how it would fit with communism.
Yeah.
Yeah, I got through maybe about a third of the article and so I got the setup, kind of got that in my head. But I liked like Nick, I liked the overall sort of framing of it, like stepping back from the kind of words and associations we have with, capitalism and socialism, which tend to, they kind of like tend to have a whole bunch of meanings to them, and so just kind of focusing on stripping away the I guess, associations and kind of focusing on the mechanism is I think it's a useful way of thinking about it. Because probably if you ask 10 political scientists what the definition of socialism, capitalism, you get 10 different answers anyway. So it's kind of nice to be able to kind of as to whether it's whether it's whether it's incompatible with a sort of end state of communism, again, maybe that a lot of that gets down to semantics. And so, but I like the way he frames the idea of and it's kind of it fits with everything we've been talking about here, which is that, the goal of the economy is to support people, whatever way works for them. In a sense, that's a kind of a communism. Whether it's communism as originally conceived, I don't know, but yeah.
Yeah.
So my thought about it, I guess I had never really thought about using one economic system to get to another economic system. They had kind of seemed either or to me and in separate worlds. And then to have this kind of laid out as, okay, we can use the system to gradually get to a different place was quite interesting. And especially towards the end when talking about the capitalist transition to communism from a utopian dream into a historical necessity, and that eventually human rationality would get us to that point of communism through capitalism was quite interesting to me. So it would be an interesting discussion as well to see whether or not we think that we would ultimately get there if we just continue on this road of capitalism, or if it's just something that we would have to logically think about and plan to get there.
Yeah.
I feel like parts of the article are really dense. But I thought it was really interesting, this idea, he sort of lays out altruism and a productive economy are what we need in order to get to communism, that people have to be willing to sort of share, and you have to have the resources to actually be shared among people. And so that was sort of interesting. It's okay, if those are the key pieces, how can, then what do we need to do to get there? And his point about instead of doing a sort of means tested social safety net, instead of just do a basic income, it gets at he does a nice job of pointing out how that gets us out of a lot of the problems of that instead of people being oh, well, I could be productive in the economy in this way, but then it's going to cut into my benefits, and so why would I do that? Why would I expend money on gas and childcare and whatever to make this small amount of money that isn't actually going to be enough to make me more than I was getting on benefits? It's well, if everyone just gets this money, then people can do incremental amounts of productivity, and so it's both good for the economy, but also gets you into that more sort of communist, people doing work because they want to be doing the work and not because they're oh, well, I have to do this or my children are going to starve. That was a nice way to sort of tie that in that I hadn't quite thought about before.
Yeah.
Well, humanity has transitioned between socialist systems before, from feudalism to mercantilism to capitalism. So it's feasible that, since no system lasts forever, that we could transition from capitalism to socialism or communism or whatever. In the Star Trek, the Ferengi transition from.
We haven't gotten that far.
Yeah, don't tell us.
I know what you're about to say.
Don't tell us. We're going through Deep Space Nine, so
yeah.
Don't give it away.
But yeah, I think that's right, that we can kind of transition into different systems, and sometimes that can be kind of a gradual thing. Whether we could ever achieve communism in the sense that they're talking about, such that there's no paid work anymore, that all work is kind of voluntary, so to speak, I don't know if that could ever happen. I think there's always going to be some work that needs doing that people given the choice, probably wouldn't really want to do. And then you'd have to have, like maybe you could do it entirely through social incentives, and maybe that would count as communism. But social incentives are not necessarily the most efficient way to provide an incentive. Like paying people is, that's
and they
okay
might not be
sometimes
the best
too.
for people. Like getting
Right.
shamed may not be better than getting money. Like to put it bluntly,
Right.
like if
Yeah.
someone needs to incentivize you to do something, it could be a good social incentive. I was picking that on
Yeah.
purpose to make it seem dramatic,
Right.
but it's not always going to be better to incentivize someone with social stuff than money is all I'm saying.
Yeah.
So you have to think about it.
So I would say that if communism is achievable in the sense that there's no monetary incentives to work,
Yeah, better though in the sense that it wouldn't make people do the task.
Well,
people would be better off.
I guess what I meant is like what we care about is people being best off, like
Right.
Alex was talking about.
Right.
So I was raising the possibility that it's not obvious whether somebody is best off being sort of socially pressured to do
Right.
something or paid
Right.
to do it. It
Okay.
kind of depends on the nature of the social pressure, which is
Right.
why I picked the example of shame, because
Right,
most people
right.
don't enjoy that much.
Right. Yeah.
But obviously it doesn't have to be shame,
Okay.
but that was kind of the example, the
Right.
way I
Not,
was
not in
raising.
terms of whether it would work better.
Well,
but-
I think also that. I
Yeah.
think Alex was raising that about efficiency. Like, it could be hard to be as precise. Certainly, social incentives aren't as
Yeah.
precise as money. Like, they don't have
Right,
different
right.
degrees really carefully, and
Yeah.
like it's hard to get people on board to do it sometimes.
There's
And
no one-to-one
so I think there's a lot
relationship.
of other logistical issues too,
Yeah.
Right.
especially in a really large society.
Right.
But
Yeah.
but also I was raising the possibility that like obviously communism is supposed to be for the benefit of the people. That's like kind of the general goal. But it's not obvious to me that if people have a financial baseline, that adding monetary incentives isn't the better way.
Right,
kind
but
of move their
then, when
behavior.
I think about communes and
Yeah.
groups like that, where people aren't shamed, but they participate in a kind of sense of humanity
Right.
that they all share. So there's this not cult-like aspect, but there's a kind of group thing that goes on.
Yeah.
And it doesn't necessarily have to be incentivized by either money or shaming.
Right.
Right.
It can be a
Yeah.
positive response
So-
to being in the group.
This is related to the kind of altruism point that they bring up in the article,
Yeah.
which is that, if we can get to a point where everyone just wants to
Wants
give
to.
and feels good
Right.
doing that,
Right.
and everything can be voluntary, that kind of thing.
Right.
Yeah.
I've never seen it, but I'm just.
You can have it as long as it's a community of people who already feel that way and they decide
Right.
to come
Get
together and form
together.
something.
Right.
At a large scale where you have to include everyone, I'm skeptical that is something we could achieve.
I guess.
go ahead,
Oh
Alan.
yeah, sorry.
Yeah, that's sort of, I was about to actually mention that because there was that interesting point where he talks about, the traditional Marxian view of transition to communism was you go through socialism, and socialism is needed to instill people with the sense of like that they're all in it together, and that would sort of change, almost like it's like almost I read it as like changing people, and maybe that's it's sort of like the it's like the kind of the polar image of like the capitalist view of what human nature is. It's sort of like, whereas like human nature is complex, like we're kind of a combination. Any one person's probably going to be motivated by selfish and altruistic reasons. So like in pure capitalism assumes that everyone's a self-optimizing, trying to get something out, but that's not real either, and neither is the idea that we're all going to be altruists. So kind of like,
Right.
in a way, I feel like it's a useful way to kind of get away from that kind of dualistic thinking in a way. Do you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah, and I think we don't need to limit ourselves to one tool or the other. I mean, I definitely think it can be good if people are motivated and it makes them happy, they feel like there's meaning or they're helping others. And I think
families do it,
Right.
on a small scale, right?
yeah, but there's reason. I mean, families are genetically related to each other, so
True,
there's a really
true.
different set of kind of underlying. But you
True.
get it
But
among
even if they're
non-families
not,
too.
I
But
mean,
yeah,
Also,
they're
a small enough
adopting.
scale community, the dynamics
much
and the
easier, yeah.
incentives are going to be very much different than like a large scale global market economy. or
Yeah,
something
right,
like that,
right.
it's just
right.
really hard.
Yeah.
Even if people want to do the right thing, I guess there's two things. Even if people want to do a good thing, the money can actually be information, can help people know how much is it
Right.
needed to do this versus this other thing, and a large scale like that.
Yeah.
But I was also going to say that I agree with Elizabeth that like if your basic, the larger the basic income, the more room there is for people to spend their time for free in ways that are helpful. Like I do think you'd see more of that, but I wouldn't personally want to take away the tool of paying people, like forbid it or something, because I don't see anything wrong with having that tool pick up the slack.
It's almost
when,
like it's a kind of a
you
nice
know-
way to kind of get the benefits of both, right?
Right.
It's like if you have
Well,
enough the basic income.
Oh.
You know, because you have enough to get your basic needs
Right.
met, but at
Yeah.
the same time, you also
Free to.
you don't. It doesn't sort of force everyone to basically assume they're being altruistic all the time. I mean, I feel like people who are always going on about capitalism being the most evil thing in the world is I mean, your system is kind of pretty bad, but there's like aspects of a market economy which do take into account some aspect of human nature, and the socialism also does that, but it's like everyone's a combination.
And the success
kind of
story of paying people for money is that whatever their self-interested motives are, you're supposed to be aligning them with the benefit of people. So then now you're paying them to do something that actually benefits other people. So that's a really great thing if you can do it. Now, as we talked about, you only benefit the people who have like money to spend. So it doesn't work so well if there's a lot of people without money to spend.
Right.
But that's not necessarily bad if you assume that people are going to have some desire to become more prestigious.
Yeah, I mean,
It's also driving.
I just
Yeah.
want to kind
Yeah, go
of
ahead.
build on
Yeah,
that point
yeah.
a little bit. So the market economy is only going to work for the people who have money. So that's going to be frustrating, when you look at it and it's not working for poor people, that kind of thing. But when you have basic income, now everybody has money, and the market incentives, the profit motives, are aligned with doing things that benefit everyone now, because now everyone has money. So I just wanted to.
Yeah, so the idea of paying
Yeah.
people is like
Yeah.
you're paying somebody, and no matter what they're like, even if their motive is selfish, you're paying them to do something that's helping other people is the goal. Like that's how it's supposed to work, I guess.
In terms of paying employees.
Yeah, the
Right.
employer or the
So
profit
once,
that the owner
once you have a
is
basic
doing,
income in
right.
place, if you're a business and your profit is derived from actually doing things that benefit consumers, now you're paying employees to help in the endeavor of benefiting everybody.
I guess just to phrase. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I just two things. First, I would be good to clarify, and I'm sorry because I didn't read the article, but clarify the definition of socialism as opposed to communism. And
Yeah.
the second thing is this. I'm still going back to this idea of group psychology changing. That psychology in a way has to change in order for there to be voluntary altruism, if you will, or even just survival mechanisms that come into play in large groups of people. Like What a Beautiful Country. Did you see it yet?
No.
Okay, so they built their own city basically in the desert, and there was nothing there, but all of the group were held together by religious belief. Okay, so they all wanted to do this thing because they were driven by.
Wasn't Burning Man though.
It wasn't Burning Man. It could have been Burning Man.
Worship the Burning
Yeah,
Man.
but so there was that driving philosophy that kept everybody
Yeah.
on the same
Yeah.
page, and it's hard for me to imagine that kind of drive. So I without
Yeah.
some other link to a guru or a weird connection that everybody gets, but that's what brings me back to socialism versus communism.
Yeah.
So
socialism is more oriented towards kind of the people control the means of production, or they decide where the product of the labor goes. So in this article, I think he said to each according to his labor, or the laborers kind of get together and decide what.
I never understood that, I guess. Marxist thing, to each according to his labor. What's an example of that?
So you get paid based on how much you contribute, is basically the idea.
Oh, okay.
Right.
As opposed to like your market value or something like that?
Right. So ordinarily in a market economy, you're getting paid based on what amount of money is necessary to provide an incentive for you to do the work.
Right,
It has nothing
right.
to do with how much value you provide, or
Right.
it does, but that's not like the main thing. Maybe you could frame it in terms of like marginal value, like the last person to get hired wouldn't get hired unless they were providing some amount of, or
It's
something,
going to be
like that kind
related
of
to
thing.
value, but also enjoyability of the work,
Right.
how scarce your talent is, or whatever. I mean, it's going
If
to
you
be
really,
all-
really want to do something, then people might not have to pay you very much to do it. So
Right,
that's why a lot of times we see more desirable jobs get paid less.
Right.
Like being a teacher is pretty cool and pretty fun. You don't get paid very much because a lot of people would love to be teachers. That's
Well,
part of it,
I
right?
understand, but
Yeah.
controlling the means of production. I mean, is that like getting stock options in a company? And what does that mean?
It can be like that a little bit, or having a kind of a worker-owned enterprise.
Cooperative.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like
Okay.
Like a
social.
credit union? Is it credit union?
The credit union
I
is
don't
kind
really
of
know what
it's
a
like
credit
a
union is.
socialist bank. Or
Okay,
So
yeah.
it's supposed to be at the level of the whole nation, basically.
Right.
I always thought
So-
it was the government, but maybe I'm wrong about that. Yeah.
You thought what was the government?
Like the socialism
Government
was
handouts?
like the government
Yeah.
controlling the economy. Kind
Oh.
of.
I think that's yeah. A lot of times it is kind of framed that way, but the government again is the agent of the people. So it's again
Right.
like the stuff is in the
But
hands of the
in
people.
practical
Right.
terms, if people are wondering, I thought it was like Russia, where they try to plan how many washing machines are needed.
Right. So there's kind of like the theory of what socialism
But maybe that's
is
not really-
ideally, which
yeah.
is that the workers are in control of their product,
Right.
and then there's like the practical implementations that we've seen, emerge in
I guess if
real
it's
life.
not a democratic government, it wouldn't technically count as socialism because it's hard to make the claim that it's the people.
I mean, the Nazis said they were socialists.
Well, I don't
you
care what the dictators say. I mean, like
the-
someone who
you know,
supports socialism might not think that was a fair.
USSR was
Test.
supposedly socialist, you know,
Right,
like that kind
right,
of stuff.
right. But I mean, yeah, but
In terms of what the definition of socialism is and what they talk about in the article, I think it's mostly workers in control of how the product of the labor is distributed. And they're imagining, that all of the economy's production is the product of labor, that labor is kind of the main thing that goes into production.
how do you
Yeah.
separate like obviously we have this image of labor, like physical labor or something.
Sure.
But how do you separate, the owner would say he's doing labor, like he's doing the paperwork or hiring people and going on talks and stuff.
Well,
I
that's
mean,
the
so
manager. That's the manager, though.
But I mean,
right? The
but I'm saying like,
capitalist-
what is it? What counts as labor?
Yeah, exactly.
Like it's obvious, maybe if you think like factory and factory owner, but like in the
Only
real
a garden,
economy,
but that you don't know the level of labor.
Well, it's become more complicated in
Right.
recent
That's
times
just
because
what
of
I'm saying,
like
yeah.
technology and increasing levels of abstraction, like
Right.
financial
Sure.
instruments, but there's still
Yeah.
a sense in which there's like someone is doing something, spending some time doing something.
Right. And
Yeah.
there's this idea that even if you're using machines or other forms of capital, it still represents kind of the labor of the people generations ago who went into like. Sometimes people take this to an extreme. I think just in
Right.
terms of this article, basically it's kind of like they're thinking to each according to his labor is kind of the socialist way of thinking about it, or the kind of their socialist. I mean, does that answer your question? Or are you
how do you
confused?
figure
I
out
still
how
can't
much?
grasp it, but maybe in relation to communism, it would help if you define the two things.
Right.
Oh,
So
yeah, that
socialism
was
would be to each according to his labor, right? And then
Yeah.
communism would be to each completely independent of what labor they contributed. It's to each according to his needs.
Everybody gets to share.
Everybody
fruits
shares.
of
All
the
labor is
economy.
kind of voluntary. You don't need to
Yeah.
pay people. So with socialism, you're still paying people for the labor, but it's more fair, kind of.
Okay.
Is this all?
Yeah.
Is this,
I like you keep looking at me as if I'm the socialist expert. It's most fellowship in this room. Yeah, that seems accurate.
yeah.
Okay.
I think that the vision of communism, as these authors are talking about, I think, is very utopian.
Right.
There's so much abundance,
Right.
so much wealth has been created because productivity has gotten so high
Yeah.
that nobody thinks of anything they're doing as work.
Right.
Yeah, there's a distinction between free time and work, kind of.
I see. Yeah. That's
And there is something about like incentives of like prestige and stuff, sort of incentivizing people in that way, but in a positive, pro-social way. But sorry, you want
Yeah,
to
no,
say
it's okay. So my understanding, according to the definitions of socialism and communism in this article, was that so each according to his labor or their labor, meaning if you're working, you still get to be part of the decision-making process of how something is divided amongst those who are working. But there's still a group of people who aren't working and they don't get anything. So there's still the idea of the alienation that exists within socialism that wouldn't exist within communism
Oh, okay.
in accordance with this definition. And communism would be, it doesn't matter if you work or not work.
Right.
Those who work contribute because that's what they're able to do, but nevertheless, everyone still shares in that social
Right.
product.
Right. Oh,
Yep.
that's great. Thank you.
That was
That's
really
good.
good.
That's
Yeah.
a good
Yeah, I
point.
defer to
That's a good
Tiffany.
discussion.
Expert on the article. Yeah.
Yeah. Interesting.
Okay, you guys ready to get into some quotes
Yeah.
from the article?
Yeah.
Okay, so here's the
Bring it
first
on.
one. Do.
Nice screenshot.
This belief is unorthodox enough. It implies, among other things, that the working class, even rather broadly defined, is not the social force that the left should systematically identify and side with.
What belief?
So the belief that you can get to communism through
Okay.
capitalism rather than socialism.
Okay.
You would love this because you're always so frustrated that people are talking about working people instead of all people.
Yes. Yes. So that's why I highlighted it,
Right.
because it's really, it kind of, in terms of how I think about basic income and kind of the psychological breakthrough that we need to get to before people kind of embrace basic income is the idea that, people are not necessarily workers, and the extent to which you are a worker, has nothing to do with the, your human value, or maybe it has something to do with it, but it's not. And people have intrinsic value, and ultimately, kind of what we want from the economy is for it to benefit people the most. It's about what we get out of the economy rather than what we put in. And when we think of people as workers, we think of them as inputs into this machine, and that's the economy exists for us. It's not about what we put into it. It's about what we get out.
And
of it.
the moral sense, if I understand correctly, the moral language is often about people deserve to have a say or to have a part of the product because they're putting something into it. So it's very much like your worth is justified by the
It's
worker.
almost taking the JFK thing about, that's not what you do for your turning on its
Yeah.
head.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it's interesting.
And I think that is the right perspective to have. That our institutions are here to serve us. The economy is here for our benefit. We wouldn't have these things if they didn't benefit the people, right? So yeah, that's why I highlighted that. Cool. Anyone have any more comments on this before we?
I think that could only be true if with something like a basic income.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes.
Otherwise, it's just not. Otherwise, I would agree with that we have to kind of because of the system they're within. But that's you kind of have to have two changes at once almost.
Yeah.
Basic income and the sort of
Mindset.
the mindset. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think it can be kind of like a little bit of a bootstrap. Like we move closer to basic income, we start to think of people less as workers, that kind of thing. Yeah.
That identification with workers, though, is meant to be out of, sympathy for the underdog in a way. And you don't identify with the wealthy class if you're on the left. And that's not just because you think of people as workers, because you're not thinking past that. You're only thinking about those are the people that aren't getting what they deserve.
Yeah.
Those are the people we need to help, and those are the people. But they're not going so far as to think about the homeless, even rather broadly defined, is not the social force of the left. It's just, they're still within the realm of.
Right.
I think that in a way, I agree in that. I think that politically, people still feel that they, without even thinking about it, have to play to this moral idea that you have to do something to deserve something.
Absolutely.
Which is a big
really
idea
hard
on the
now.
right, obviously. But even people on the standard political left are playing into that in a way by focusing on workers instead of
They
just
think they're
people.
not there. Yeah.
Right. I mean, in the sense that that's supposed to be, I think, the justification that people should be treated better
Right.
rather
Right.
than
Because
just
they're
being people.
contributing.
Yeah.
Even if it's.
And I think the way they get around this a little bit sometimes, the people on the left, is they say, well, this homeless person or this unemployed person is a worker who is currently not
Potentially.
working.
Yeah.
Or maybe they're
Yeah.
being kept from
Right.
working by the system or something like
I mean,
that.
of course they do
Yeah.
care about those people, but there's
Right.
still this framework, as I guess my point.
Yeah, and I think it can kind of make sense if you're trying to if some people are saying, oh, rich people are rich because they earned what they got, they deserve it. You can kind of imagine coming up with a counter argument saying, no, the poor people are the ones who actually did the work,
Right.
therefore they deserve some of it
Yeah,
too.
that's what I mean by
Right.
playing into the same
Yeah.
narrative. In a bigger picture sense, it's the same narrative that
Yeah.
you have to earn what you deserve or whatever, and then there are just different arguments about who's earned what and
Right.
and all of that.
Yeah.
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 Okay, next one.
Oh, what was the beginning of that first place?
This one?
Nonetheless. Oh, is this the next page that you're going to, or just a different
No, that's
one?
just another
Okay,
sentence.
okay.
I can't just
Ignore the nonetheless.
Okay.
Yeah.
yeah, ignore the
Wasn't
nonetheless.
there.
Also ignore the first place.
Okay.
So we have sympathy for those, mainly economists, who say one should not waste time investigating the ethical desirability of a scheme that is not economically workable. And we understand those, mainly philosophers, who say there is no point in investigating the economic feasibility of a proposal that is ethically unacceptable. But denying the usefulness of investigating either economic feasibility or ethical desirability before having established or at least discussed a scheme's political chances is unwarranted and irresponsible. For what is politically feasible depends largely on what has been shown to make economic and ethical sense. In any case, our ambition in writing and publishing this article is not to provide a full-fledged plea At several junctures, we will point out important gaps that would need to be filled, but merely to set the stage for a meaningful discussion about whether the transition path described is, if feasible, desirable, and if desirable, feasible.
This is very high language.
It's very academic.
Yeah.
So I mean, I think the main point that's being made here is that politics kind of follows someone somewhere, academics maybe, figuring out what makes sense, what's actually doable, what's actually good for people. Then the politics follows, right? You can't say, like if we figure out the perfect scheme, an argument against that isn't, that it's politically not viable, because once you've figured out the perfect scheme, that's the first step. And then the next step is to figure out the politics.
I mean, I think that's he's basically putting his finger on something that's important, which is that common sense is often like determined by, like experts in the field who may have a vested interest in like the status quo or sort of, kind of like well settled arguments. And so you have to kind of like go, if you really want to change things, you kind of have to kind of push the envelope a little bit. That's at least as I read this.
I think that's right. And this is actually a big part of why I try to steer these discussions away from kind of the political discussion, because the political discussion only makes sense if the other stuff is all figured out already. Or maybe not only, but like this is important too. This is an important part of supporting it. Yeah. Richard.
Andrew Yang points out that before Nixon proposed the family assistance plan, so a bunch of politicians were asked if a guaranteed income was possible, and they said no, that was impossible. And then a few months later, Nixon proposed the family assistance plan, and they were asked again, and they said, "Oh, that's totally possible."
Yeah.
So could be hard to predict what's politically feasible too sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, it's like trying to predict whether it's practical or not, or whether you can implement something, idea. And politically, I mean, you can't even really fathom that yet.
I mean, before Social Security existed, people were saying that's not possible.
Right,
you can't do
sure.
that. And then all of a
How
sudden,
could it be
it's like
possible?
it's totally irreplaceable.
Yeah,
like, no
right,
one can ever imagine.
It's a crazy
Get
idea.
it? Yeah, right.
Right.
Yeah. So I think for me, I kind of place more emphasis on the economic feasibility rather than the ethical desirability. Obviously, if something's economically feasible but not ethically desirable, then you still wouldn't want to do it. Like it's economically feasible to, nuke the entire planet and
That's not a good plan.
or all the major cities at least. But it's not a good plan, right?
Also,
we have the resources to do it.
It's still trying to be circular, isn't it? Because ultimately, an economic system builds into it certain assumptions about human behavior, and those assumptions about human behavior are somewhat based on ethical judgment to some degree.
Yeah.
It's hard. I mean, it's hard to be completely objective about what is human nature. I mean, I feel like you see this all the time. People do economic arguments for things. It's like, well, people will do this because the incentives are right. I mean, it's true. They will, but on average, when you do it over thousands of people, on average, people do that. But any individual person is going to be complicated.
Sure. Yeah.
So I feel like that's like another factor that sort of goes into like just defining whether something's feasible or not, because and the desirability and feasibility isn't easy to disentangle.
Yeah, and I think with ethical desirability, a lot of times when we're making these kind of moral judgments, we have a lot of assumptions built in there, including about like how the economy works. Like, well, if we don't make everyone contribute, then the economy will fall apart. Therefore it's morally wrong to not let people contribute. That kind of thing.
Right. Let people not contribute.
Yeah.
Right.
So I mean, I like to be very simple. We've had discussions on morality in here before, but I like to be very simple in terms of kind of like moral stuff. I think of morality as kind of, and we've talked about this as kind of a shortcut to reasoning. So if you have a certain moral position, it lets you make snap judgments about whether something's right or wrong, that kind of thing. But if we're trying to think about how the system should work at a deeper level, or how it would best work for the benefit of people, a moral lens is not necessarily the most useful lens, because the morality is necessarily kind of a heuristic, a shortcut. right?
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, shortcut based on what? What's the long cut?
So it enforces like cooperation. Everyone's on the same page. They're all kind of following the same rules. So think about religion, right? It gets everyone on the same page, working towards the same cause.
Right.
You know, and there's some people who, you know, like everybody on all sides of the political spectrum or everywhere on the political spectrum, you know, believes that their view is morally right and they have
Right.
moral justifications for it.
Mhm.
That doesn't answer the question of what's actually best for people. What's going to ensure that people are as, you know, well off as possible, right?
It's a way to be like, usually it's a way to be doing well with your like in-group members or the circle of people around you.
Right.
Kind of like
Your
the
what
people around you, your in-group members.
Oh, yeah.
It's an emotional cue to tell you kind of what to do so you don't get in trouble with those people a lot of the time
Right.
too. Not necessarily the whole country, but like whoever's around you.
Yeah.
Right.
Or that you care about.
But isn't there's still a sense which is a moral judgment when you're saying you should want the economy to work well for everybody? That's itself a sort of
It
a
is,
moral
yeah.
decision.
I think it's a less controversial one though. Like I
Yeah.
think even like free
Less-
market
less
people would
controversial than
say,
what?
like free market people would say that's how it works best for the benefit of the people, and
Yes.
communists would say this is what works best
Right.
for the benefit. So really, what's different is like assumptions about how it's going to actually play out, or
I
like
agree.
you know, almost like the feasibility is more what's at.
But there are definitely people,
Yeah.
I think, who really think that the world works in like really super fundamentally conservative people who think that basically there's a kind of a hierarchy of being. You know, there are people who are naturally on top. And
Yeah, that's true.
people-
I guess
so
that's interesting.
that
I-
isn't normally you don't hear that in the political discourse because it's verboten, but it's kind of
But they also believe
hidden
that
under the
allowing that hierarchy of being to assert itself is what's best for everyone, right?
that's true.
What's
yeah.
best for society. So
Yeah.
it still comes back to that a little bit.
And I think if
Yeah.
you go to the economic theorists that are less like the political people or just the people who happen to be rich, they would probably justify it even more in terms of the way that it's supposed to benefit everybody.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think like people who research the economy from a free market point of view, they have all these views about how it aligns incentives for the benefit of everyone and all that kind of thing, right?
Yeah, you want the rich people to be as rich as possible because that provides an incentive to keep doing the thing that they did to make themselves rich. That
Which
kind
is
of thing.
supposed to be benefiting
Yeah,
people.
yeah.
I know we've talked about that doesn't always play
Yeah,
out, but that's
right.
that's the idea, right?
I mean, I think
Yeah.
I agree. I think there's definitely a benefit to not using kind of morally judgmental language as a
Right.
way to discuss it. But at the same time, I don't think you can never completely get out of like at some level a moral judgment. I just don't
So,
think it's possible.
On some level, you have to decide what you want, and that
That's-
has to there's kind of like this ultimate thing that you want that's not justified by anything else.
Right.
That doesn't necessarily mean that it's a moral thing.
Well,
you know,
we
you could
disagreed
you
on
could
that.
frame
We had
that
another
you could
theory.
frame that as a moral thing. But when I think about morality, I'm thinking about kind of the emotional shortcuts that we use to support kind of
Kind of
what
like
we
our
ultimately
knee-jerk
want.
reactions. to
Knee-jerk
things,
reactions,
kind
that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So it's similar to moral judgments in that there's nothing, there's no reasoning supporting it other than, like I want to live in a world where, humanity is as prosperous as possible because that seems like a cool world to live in. That's not necessarily a moral feeling on my part. It doesn't feel necessarily moral to me. And certainly I do have a morality that's kind of built around that, but I don't think it's necessarily ultimately a
I think
moral.
Well, it
Maybe
is in
maybe a
comparison
different language or
to I
something,
want to
yeah.
be
Yeah.
the richest person in the world, and I don't really care what happens to the other people. That's a moral.
Would you
position.
say that's moral?
Yeah.
Would you say that
Yeah.
person feels like it's a moral position?
Immoral? Yeah.
Immoral.
Yeah, immoral.
The person who feels that way
Yeah,
feels it's
yeah.
immoral?
No, the person who feels that way may not feel that,
Okay.
but
But it's
what-
an
what
example
you're
of
describing
this kind of thing that we might not classify as moral.
For
That's
what
what
it's
you're
worth, though, like
we might not classify it as
Yeah.
moral, just like you're talking about the way
Right.
you describe it,
Right.
as moral, not classifiable as moral. But those two things contrast with each other, and one would play out as moral and immoral.
In the judgment of others, yeah.
And there is such a thing as amorality, where they don't take ethical considerations at all. They
Yeah.
don't think about ethics at all. They just do what they want to do because that's what they want to do.
Yeah, and I think, the existence of humanity is ultimately amoral. Like, does it matter whether humanity exists or not in grand scheme of the universe,
So
whatever,
Alex,
right?
I think that
Yeah.
in this he's saying
Some people might disagree with you on
I don't think
that.
we'll buy that one so fast.
Yeah.
Yeah.
well, I mean, I don't know if it really matters, but I
Yeah.
think he's talking about philosophers. So he's more talking about like how people actually
Yes.
contemplate what they value, and
Right.
so it's a bit more like you saying that you want the society to be prosperous than it is about knee jerk. It's a bit of an interplay, but if it's philosophers, then and I don't know if it really matters, but I think he's talking about this question of what we want things to be like versus the practicality of can they be like that. That's what I think he's talking about.
I think that's right. I mean, I would say that philosophers, their job is basically to create a logical framework around these, heuristic moral intuitions that humanity has, and try to create like a consistent
Yeah, I
picture of
think
like
that's right.
something that ultimately, kind of it all derives from, or something like that. I don't think that's necessarily a useful exercise. I think it's,
Anyway, I agree
yeah.
with you, but I think that right here,
Yeah.
I'm just saying he's talking more
He also
about,
is a philosopher, by the way.
I think he's talking about
Yeah,
what
sure.
Alex was talking about, which is like this question of what we want things to be like, and then this other question of how do we make that happen? Is that possible?
Okay.
I think that's the two sort of things that he really is interested in here. I think those are the two things.
With basic
Yeah.
income, you'd have a lot more time for philosophers to sit around to
Yeah, right.
create
For better
like,
or for worse.
air castles of sort of, kind of
Yeah.
philosophical frameworks for understanding the universe or something.
So I think you're right to some extent. I think if you read the rest of the article, you might realize that some of the things they're talking about as ethics, and they provide they provide different kind of moral perspectives of like what different people might morally want, and they don't necessarily bias themselves toward one or the other.
Okay.
And one of them is like ultimate equality, where the basic income is at the minimum level that still allows subsistence, but you want to keep it as low to that minimum level as possible, just to provide more equality of freedom among
Like keep
people,
people
or something
down in
like
order
that.
to keep them equal, basically.
Yes, that's right.
What did you say about that?
Keep people down to keep them equal.
Oh,
Right,
mhm.
right.
I want to say just one more thing about this, because you often talk about the economics of this
Sure.
in favor, not as against the moral aspect of basic income or against the social aspect, but you foreground the economic part of that mostly and how it will help the economy work.
Well, how it will ultimately help people be more prosperous.
Well,
have people be as
that's-
well off as possible. Yeah.
Okay, so,
Yeah.
but was that a driving force, or was that people being more prosperous kind of a result of the way of thinking about the economic system being more efficient? Because I feel like those two things aren't necessarily equal in your mind.
I'll tell you how I thought of basic income. I looked at the economy and I was like, wait a minute, we could give people money that would actually work. We should do that.
Okay,
And the reason we should do that is because people are better off if
So
they
it's
have
the
money.
people
Yeah.
that were first, not how
People
we
are
can
always-
talk about the economy working better with basic income
Right.
too, with consumer spending, making it more efficient.
Right. And I also talk about the economy working for the benefit of the people.
Right.
Like,
Right.
what does
But-
it mean for the economy to work
Right.
better?
Yeah.
I mean, he means better.
Better
for people.
supporting
Yeah.
the prosperity of people.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The
Yeah.
surprising thing
continue.
for me, though, in this article was, again, coming back to the definition of what communism is, and at least in the Marxist perspective, that it was trying to make the most of productivity and most of utility, and that it specifically said in here that justice and ethics, if relevant at all, was secondary.
It did say that. Yeah.
So this was a really interesting thing for me, because similarly I have the idea of communism's for the benefit of the people, the maximum number of people, but that has the moral perspective. This sounds much more economical.
What's this?
The article.
The article.
The article.
Yeah, in the definition of communism.
Yeah.
According to the article,
Right.
that it's much more focused on what can actually be produced and how can you maximize production, not from
Right.
a capitalist profit maximization, but using all of the available labor and using all of the available like money or capital or anything. How can you possibly maximize the production so that people do have more, but the background was not a moral or
thing.
ethical.
That's very
Yeah.
similar to what.
Yeah.
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 And so that was quite shocking for me,
Yeah.
because when I think about people who want communism, it's for the betterment of people,
You
but
think-
that's
yeah,
kind of
yeah.
removed
I
from
think that's
this.
still true, though.
And those
Yes.
those things are very much compatible and intertwined with each other too. Like if you're
Yeah.
maximizing the economy as product and maximizing the extent to which that social product is distributed to people, you're also kind of maximizing welfare. So they're
Yeah.
very much aligned
Right,
with each other.
right.
Nick, did you have something? Richard?
Well, I've read that you could use a VAT to find out what's being sold, and then you can use that information and plug it into a supercomputer and create a planned economy where you don't.
Don't have the people
Yeah.
involved.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And a planned economy would be a single massive supercomputer system would be more efficient than all these supercomputer in this company and supercomputer in that company.
There was they were actually trying to do that in I think it was in Chile, so the Allende government back in the 70s.
Yeah.
Like they actually had this whole program called like cyber or something or other, but the whole point of it was to like, and of course it was, computers were a lot less powerful now, but they created the system, and then of course there was Pinochet came.
Pinochet, right, and then the Chicago economy.
And the Chicago
Yeah.
economy, and everything got blown up, but where was I going with that? So, there's a newer version of that I was reading, which was a couple of authors, this guy Lee Phillips, and had this, I think I brought it in once, was called The People's Republic of Walmart, and basically making the argument kind of like what you're saying, which is that, like in theory, hypothetically, you could create a planned economy, and in fact, Amazon and Walmart are effectively, they're big planned economies, they're just at the level of the firm. And in fact, he contrasted it with another example, which was like Sears, like when someone came into Sears and then they turned it into these little, did what the Chicago economists would say you should do, like break everything up and have them all compete.
Have the departments compete.
Compete. It was a complete disaster. So there's something in that. I don't know how it fits exactly with all of this stuff, but there's something about, it seems to me that it's some parts of that idea are not impossible to make.
Yeah. Yeah, at the level of the firm now, it's the planners are competing with each other to come up with the best plan instead of the competition being within the firm itself. Yeah, and that gets really big at the level of Amazon. So yeah, it's interesting. Yeah,
it's a little bit tangential, but it sort of touches on this idea of like what level of control.
Yeah, I don't know that you could have a supercomputer just do a planned economy for the whole economy, no matter how powerful it is, because once you plan it out, like you were talking about getting information about how much stuff needs to be produced by VAT and prices and stuff like that. But once the economy is entirely planned, you lose all the price information because it's all planned out. People are no longer voting with their dollars in terms of what should be produced and that kind of thing. So you just don't have the information, regardless of how much computational power you have. You don't have the information anymore. So I don't think that you could do that at the level of the whole economy. But the Amazon, Walmart example, those are pretty large scale. So there's certainly some level of planning that's possible. But they still have prices that are determined by the market economy, or they have feedback from the market economy.
And maybe there's parts of the economy that we do decide don't want to be run in a market way, and this would be a way to do that.
Right.
Within the context of a larger
I think that's right.
economy.
Yeah. So Michael on the live stream says, I think sometimes people make a moral argument to seem objective and out of fear of being seen as selfishly making that argument because they want that thing personally. I think that's right. I think they do that with economic arguments too. I think it's not that I want to do all this stuff. It's that it's it's good for the economy. It's morally right. That kind of thing. So certainly there's a lot of motivated reasoning going on in any.
There's a great
any
Simpsons clip where Marge finds like a discounted suit that she really wants to buy, but she's like doesn't want to treat herself, and Lisa's like, you don't have to rationalize everything, and she's like, fine, I will buy it. It'll be good for the economy. So she's like, exactly.
That's funny.
So anyway, I think people use a lot of different arguments to justify things.
Yeah.
But if you're really an economist, then you have some constraints, I guess, on the economic arguments, whereas moral arguments are kind of slippery.
You have some constraints, but you can get pretty far
That's true.
with your politics and, kind of, or what you want, your selfishness, what you want for yourself, and, creating kind of an economic model around that.
I guess I was thinking like an academic economist might be held to like a higher standard, but maybe not.
Higher standard in terms of rigor, maybe,
Yeah.
in terms of being able to justify it more completely, but maybe not in terms of. It's really hard to tease apart. Like, Milton Friedman is very politically motivated, and he's a very respected economist, and
Yeah, I mean, I feel like it's like they build air castles just as much as the philosophers do. So I don't think. I mean, I think it says something about the cultural place that economics has in a society to some degree, which is that we defer so much to economic reason, not because that is maybe the most fundamental aspect of humans, but just because we're being. I mean, one could argue that we were sort of programmed to do that because, I mean, you look at like with the crash, like it was so many people, didn't pay attention to what was going on because the economists said, we've got this, we're you don't, and also like it all seems so very abstract and I think it worked to their benefit. Like, I mean, I say they, I mean, I think like big banks and. That works to their benefit to have that be sort of like shrouded in mystery a little bit.
I used to be like really down on economists, but I've learned a lot more about economics from Alex. And I think part of the issue is like we really do need these answers. Like there is a science to be had, and we need the answers. But there's also like a lot of abstractness, complexity, and political motivation. Yeah. And it's really hard for like anyone, even in the field, let alone outside of the field, to like. Really get the right
it's not a diss on economists at all. It's more a diss on sort of like the sort of the high priest of economics that we give so much credence to. Yeah. Whereas we don't give the equivalent of if for political, like this is the difference between say France and the US. Like in France, I mean, I'm not sure if this is completely true, but it's my understanding is that on a serious talk show, you have a French moral philosopher come on and have a long discussion. Maybe they don't do it as much as they used to, but whereas like here, that wouldn't happen. It would be like they're given it because the economy is the most important thing.
I see what you mean.
See what I mean? Like I'm just saying, it holds that sort of high status culturally.
Right, and I guess that's interesting because the way I would have thought about it, but your philosopher sort of speaks against that, is that like these answers are just really important. So like even if we only have kind of like very imperfect people trying to give those answers, that like that's why we care so much, is like they're very high stakes. But you're right that if other cultures maybe they weigh other things differently. So I don't know.
Like in Europe, they have a lot of a tradition of philosophy with like Rousseau and Rawls. Not Rawls. I think Rawls is American.
Yeah. So I think it's interesting that basic income has been kind of promoted and kept alive through the decades primarily by philosophers rather than economists. I think that's a double-edged sword.
Yeah,
I'm glad
I was going to say that could make it look bad to someone who really wants to.
Well, I'm glad they're keeping it going. I think we need some more economists in there.
Well, it's a concept that kind of comes at lots of different angles. So you don't need all these people in the discussion, I feel.
Mm-hmm. You guys ready for another quote?
Yeah.
The content of work, its organization, and the human relations associated with it could and should be altered that extrinsic
should be so
altered that extrinsic rewards, whether material or not, would be less and less necessary to prompt a sufficient supply of labor. Work, to use Marx's phrase, could and should become life's prime want. By proceeding along this dimension, the improvement of work up to the point where it is no longer work, the transition to communism need not rely in any way on the development of altruism, nor indeed on any other transformation of human nature. It takes persons and their preferences as they are, but alters the nature of paid work up to a point where it is no longer distinguishable from free time. Even if we grant that only socialism can turn people into altruistic beings, therefore, it does not follow that socialism is indispensable to reaching communism.
Wow.
So this is kind of what Alex was talking about before.
Yeah.
That the idea is we get so productive that the only work we need starts to just feel like what people want to do anyway.
Yeah, that's a
Yeah.
hard leap.
Yeah.
That's a hard leap. That's a very difficult idea to think about people conflating work and basically play. I mean,
Oh, that's a hard idea?
not for some people, but I mean, they've done lots of experiments with children that once they start to give them rewards for things that they already like to do, then it becomes work. Then it becomes something they're doing for an external
Right.
reward or authority approval. And it's really built in. I mean, it's a built-in kind of reaction from humans. So this
Well-
idea that it could be switched like that, I don't know.
Yeah. that's
But I mean, there's also, there's like the Tom Sawyer effect, like that there's plenty of ways in which you can flip that to be like, oh, this thing,
It's fun.
which you also do with kids all the time.
Yes, it's
To be
true.
like, oh yeah, like
Yeah.
of course, Timmy, like you want to help Dad like sweep the kitchen, like yeah,
Right.
this is super fun. We're gonna just
Right.
like sweep and like.
Well, that works
you're
for a
making-
while,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
then
I try
they
that
start
all
to
the
see
time.
the rest of it. Yeah.
And I mean, in that, there's like the gamification of stuff now.
Yeah.
Sort of people
Yeah.
like motivating themselves, be like, oh, I want to, exercise more, so I'm gonna
Right,
sort of
right.
gamify this to be
Right,
like
right, yeah.
a thing that I want to
Yeah.
do that like, feels like work. I mean, not in the like
Right.
market labor kind of way, but in the same
Right.
like this is a sort of drudgery kind of thing. But like,
But we really
oh, I'm
are
gonna sort of
split.
gamify and add in these rewards, even if it's just like my phone gives me like shiny explosions. You're like, oh, cool.
Right.
I think a lot
You
of
develop your own rewards.
I
Yeah.
think a lot of it comes down to the conflation of work and jobs.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah,
like,
that too.
Like,
Yeah.
there's all this sort of, like sort of work play,
Yeah.
how that all works
Right.
together, but also this idea that, and I think kids are socialized in this, like, whenever you like, people say, oh, what do you want to be when you grow up?
Yeah,
This
yeah.
the implicit assumption is that it's kind of like the answer people are looking for is what kind of job are you going to
That's
do,
right.
what profession you're going to do,
Yeah.
and I'm actually at the point now where I'm sort of like trying to like, whenever someone says that, I'm like, well, do you have to have a choice like that? I mean,
Yeah.
it's kind of like, because it's like, you kind of get programmed into like
It's set very
assuming-
early.
It's set really
Yeah, yeah.
early,
In school too.
In
I mean,
school.
and it's work and then it's play.
right?
It's just very divided. It's so primal too. I don't know. This idea that the transformation of human nature. Well, yeah, that's no small thing.
But he's saying it's not necessary.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
know
I
it's
think
not,
that's what
but
it's.
I disagree. I mean, I think there is a transformation necessary, at least in this society.
I feel like this is sort of the heart of what I like about this article, because I think that a lot of times when we in these conversations imagine a world where nobody needs a job
Right.
to pay the rent or buy their groceries, that that is going to be a really powerful force for reorganizing the work that needs to get done to make it fun. Because if a lot of people aren't working because they no longer need to, they're going to be bored and they're
Right.
going to be looking for stuff to do. And so if you can figure out how to make something that's economically productive attractive to those people, then you could have lots of people working in your factory without paying them.
Right.
even.
And kind of work depends on being paid. The definition of work really depends on having some kind of extrinsic reward.
Well, the
connected with it.
definition of job
Job.
certainly
Jobs,
is.
Yeah.
jobs, not
Yeah.
necessarily work that you want to do.
Right.
But so if you take away the extrinsic reward from something, maybe that will be enough to transform it. I mean, basic income could be that way of transforming something that it doesn't have to be connected to
Sure.
getting paid for it. I agree with that.
I
what
mean,
Nick was
this,
saying.
like, having, I've never read Marx in the original, but so
What?
it's really
In German. In German.
In German.
but it's really striking to to see that, like, to have it framed this way. Like, that's what Marx
Yeah.
was talking about.
Yeah.
This, like, utopia that Marx is talking about is that's why I think this article is so genius, right? It seems very
Yeah.
contradictory,
Mhm.
but they work these two things around to to looking just the same.
Yeah.
And I think that's very striking.
Yeah. Richard.
Well, the first year I was in my residence hall in college, they had a voluntary committee that created all these events, and the next year they paid people and had a minimum set of events that they had to plan, and we did way more events with the voluntary committee than we did with the minimum.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think a certain thing is true that, a lot of the work we do is intrinsically motivated. That the labor market is only there for when we want to provide an incentive for people to do something other than what, they'd ordinarily do. So I think that part is true. I think it's also true that the amount of necessary extrinsically motivated labor in the economy is going down over time in terms of, the economy being able to reach its full potential and everything. Maybe we don't need as much total work, that kind of thing. I think that's true. But I also think it's always going to be true that people might want to pay other people to do something other than what they would ordinarily want to do. So I don't think we'll ever reach kind of this end goal of all work is voluntary and indistinguishable from free time, that kind of thing. But it can get a lot closer.
But that
right?
force that we were talking about, it seems like that would be a consistent. It would. Maybe it's only asymptotically
right
getting there, but it seems like the force would still be pushing in that direction. Like this force that we're talking about would still be pushing in that direction.
Yeah.
And to the extent that the further we go in that direction, the higher the basic income we can pay, maybe, or at least, or maybe like
it's more the higher the basic income we can pay, the further it pushes us in that direction, right?
Yeah.
Because now, basic income is really high, my life is great, but someone's saying, hey, I'll pay you some money to do this thing. Now it's like, oh, this is exciting. I want to spend my time this way, earn a little extra money, right? You could imagine a future in which nobody feels like they're being exploited at a job or something like that. But that doesn't mean there wouldn't be jobs and there wouldn't be a labor market.
Yeah, but it could be like I think I'm with you and Nick, that like it could be very different in the way that we think about our day-to-day lives, because it wouldn't be like the main thing that we go and like do all the time would necessarily be paid work. It might be like most of what we're doing all the time is like voluntary stuff, much of which is helpful to other people or productive, and then like the money is kind of just like an additional lever.
Right.
And how much you need that lever partly depends on who's right about like how much people want to do, with other incentives or like, just intrinsically. And that's fine. Like we don't, like you often say, we don't actually have to know that in advance, because we can just use the financial lever for what's left over and try to amp up what other good motivations we think as much as we want to amp them up.
Those things will just affect the level of basic income the economy can
or the
sustain.
level of payment you need to give people too, I guess is part of what
I would say those two things are
connected.
two sides of the same
I see,
coin.
yeah.
How much money do you need to withhold from people to get them to go out and to get paid work?
So I guess what I'm saying is like if people are right that people can be if everything in the economy that needs to be done at a certain point could be done without paying people, like then you could sort of like find that out with a basic income system.
Yes.
Because you would just keep raising the basic income and then people wouldn't be needing to be paid for anything. I guess what I'm trying to say is like we don't have to answer this question of human nature in advance. You can kind of like find it out.
I think that's one of the
saying.
chief benefits. The other thing I feel like is that the nature of, like they said, work, all these things people are doing will still be kind of work in some sense, because I think work also has you got to unpack what that means, because we often use like work to mean life's work, or I created a work of art, or it's like this something about like you're doing something creative or pushing up and pushing through boundaries, and that's not going to go away.
Right.
Yeah.
It's just that not as many things will, they won't necessarily need to be always paid for those things.
Right, and we don't know too. There are people who like to do a lot of things more than other people, and will do them, voluntarily, just because for the pleasure of doing things.
Right.
Just because they were active, they like to use their. Other people don't want to do that.
Yeah.
I like to say,
it's like at your wedding, and
wait,
all those people that were staying late and doing all
Oh
kinds of
yeah,
stuff,
right.
They were into it.
Yeah.
They were really
they also
into
had
it.
some strong
Some people
social
left early.
incentives.
What?
They also had some strong social incentives.
Yeah.
to clean up once some people started.
Yeah.
I mean, I feel like, personally, I feel like that if we did have space income, it would just, for certain personalities, like, don't like myself, I don't like doing just one thing all the time. I like to do multiple things, and but the thing is, like, when you're trying to build a quote unquote career, which is normally considered a series of jobs, working your way institution, like that, it looks from the outside that you're like either a dilettante or kind of like not really committed to the career, which is basically saying you're not committed to a job, but that's not really the case. It's like that's. To me, like, but that's because I'm, privileged and lucky to be in that position in the first place. But for a lot of people,
fill in that resume. What are you doing over here? You're supposed to be focused over here.
Right.
Yeah.
So, kind of to your point, Mom, about with basic income, the people who want to do the work are going to be the ones doing the work, that kind of thing. I like to say that basic income filters out the workers who don't want to be there.
Right.
The incompetent, we could call them incompetent, lazy, or just they want to be doing something else with their time, right?
Yeah.
Or their time is best served doing something else. It filters those people out, and it leaves the people who really want to be doing that work for that pay, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And I don't think we're ever going to move on from having jobs and having a labor market, but I think we could certainly move on from earning a living, having that even be a thing that you have to earn your living.
Cubicles.
Cubicles.
We can move on from
Peter
cubicles.
Given in the office space where he takes the things in the cubicle and just just goes in and stands back, and then the two Bobs, the consultants come in and say, "Oh yeah, your management material right there." I think we'll move on from earning a living, and I think we'll probably move on from questions like when you ask a kid, what do they want to be when they grow up, or what do they want to do when they grow up? It's, we'd probably still be asking those questions, but it would be less about, what job do you want to have, or something like that. I hope that, we'll know we're making progress when the answer to that question isn't people aren't necessarily expecting you to say, I want to be a truck driver, or not that there's anything wrong with being a truck driver, but it would be, I don't know what that's an interesting question for another time, but what could be a new...
I like motors, I like the free open air.
I read something recently where someone asked a toddler what he wanted to do when he grew up, and he said, did you read this?
No, but it's just a silly question.
And he said pizza.
Yeah.
And they're like, oh, so you want to be a pizza chef? You want to own a pizza shop or something? He was like, no, he just wanted to eat pizza when he grew up.
I mean, that's what I was laughing, because it's they don't even know what the different jobs are.
They have no idea what's involved in it.
Why would you ask?
Maybe the implicit thing with that job thing is because I think there is a kind of view in society that a job kind of like the discipline and the mastery shapes you and creates character and there's something to that argument too, which I don't completely disagree with, but the idea that it has to be tied to paid work, but figuring out how to do that is tricky,
But even at the moment, I don't feel like we aim for mastery, at a young age. I mean, I can only speak to my parents, and they only had the best of intentions for me, but it was do good in school so you can go to a good college, so you can get a good job. It was there was a very steady stream of what you needed to do in order to succeed.
Kind of mechanical almost.
Yeah, and the point was to make a good amount of money so you could be safe in life and
yes,
relax. Yes. But the point was not do something that you're interested in or become especially skilled in it. It was do all of these things so you could have a good job. Yeah. And it would be really great if that again wasn't the consideration, that you don't plan your entire life from a young age to just get a good job so you can live. It's doing something that you're passionate about, or spending time, or actually doing something of interest that you could bring to the table for a community as a whole, and where there might be missing something where the whole time you just go, well, that's not a real career. I can't make a living doing this, so I can't do it.
Or spend time trying to find out.
Well, it would transform what education is for, because then people wouldn't be well, I'm getting my kid into this school so they can be the feeder school for that school. They get them to Harvard.
I think maybe a portion of the economy is based on that idea, but yet all these people are underemployed. They get all these degrees that should get them somewhere, but they lack the positions for them to be placed into them.
Yeah, and I mean, underemployed, that's a kind of a weighty term there too. You know, like what does it mean to be underemployed? That kind of thing, based on society's expectations.
Underemployed means you're a barista, but you don't need a bachelor's degree to become a barista.
Like you have skills that you've acquired, official like recognized skills acquired beyond, or degrees acquired beyond, like what you have.
Yeah, I mean, I know what it kind of means.
No, I know what
but
you mean.
We can think about it at a deeper level. Like, why is there such a thing as being underemployed?
Well, I mean, lots of times applying for jobs in the 70s, you could be seen as overqualified. And sometimes people would try to minimize what their qualifications were because they really needed the job.
Right.
Because overqualified was bad. It's like they're going to be unhappy in the job.
Right.
Yeah.
And it would like transform, like we wouldn't have to have like adjunct professors, you know, like zooming from one campus to another and earning like $3,000 a course, you know, they're not really, they just to feel like they're staying in the game.
Yeah. You ever see the movie Falling Down with Michael Douglas?
Yeah.
He gets fired from his job and can't get another one, and he goes on a murderous rampage.
Yeah, with a briefcase, right?
I didn't know that was
he has his
there.
briefcase the whole time and a suit and his glasses, and he's like got a shotgun, and he's
Michael Douglas?
It's Michael Douglas,
Yeah,
and
that was in
he's
the 90s,
he's ranting about how he's overqualified and underemployed, and you know, like
his license plate was defense.
Right.
He was like a defense contractor.
Right.
That's what his original.
Interesting.
Yeah. All right. Yeah. You already know.
Next quote.
Or first, Michael says what most people really mean when they ask young people what they are going to do is how are you going to make money?
Yeah. Like you guys were saying.
Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah. All right. Next quote. Even if labor were the sole primary factor of production, selecting techniques in such a way as to maximize labor productivity would be justified only under very special conditions. If one is to maximize utility from consumption per capita for a given working time. And what is the point of producing if not to consume, and the point of consuming if not to derive utility from
I
it?
spent some time on this.
What?
I find that difficult to understand.
Yeah, which part?
Well, probably about halfway through the things that he's...
It sounds like something that you might say.
It does.
Yeah.
Doesn't it?
Yeah.
Even if labor were the sole primary factor.
I think I'm just stuck on labor.
It is kind of like it's written in a not so.
So techniques they're talking about like what kind of system we want, what kind of system we want to design. What should the level of basic income be? What should the level of taxation be? That kind of thing.
What I'm getting stuck on is like labor productivity. I think he means that a different way than I'm taking it, because otherwise all of his points seem to be the same, or like I'm not seeing where the...
I think in other places in the article they define labor productivity kind of in the conventional sense, like how much output are you getting for what's being put in. One thing that they're careful to do is they're saying it's not just about the amount of time, labor hours going in, but it's also about the amount of effort or the cost people are having to pay to do that work, how much disutility there is in doing the labor.
So why does he have a problem with that then? That seems good.
If I remember correctly, the context of this is he's saying, you know, even under socialism, you're not guaranteed, unless you make special assumptions, that if your criteria for the design of your system, like your plan for the economy, if the criterion is maximizing the utility from consumption, you're not guaranteed to set things up that maximize labor productivity. And he gives us examples saying, you know, you could if there are two ways to do something,
right,
and one of them uses less labor than the other.
Under socialism, you might want to use more labor because then people would get more reward for that.
He sort of sets it up saying under, you know, like capitalism doesn't get us that close to this because it's not hard to think of an example where it's more profitable to use like cheap labor to do something than, you know, even though there's another way to do it where you could save all that labor some other way of doing it.
I see. Yeah.
If it's more profitable, you use more labor. But he's saying even under socialism, you're not really it's only under special conditions that you're necessarily going to be trending towards you're going to arrive at the maximum labor productivity.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Right. You'd have to get lucky, and in your socialist system, you somehow have achieved an efficient labor market.
And in
something
fact,
like that,
wouldn't
yeah.
people have the incentive to do as much labor as possible because that's what their share is getting determined by?
Yes, in
Wouldn't
terms
it push
of
towards, like,
as
labor
as
efficiency?
you know, earn as much money as possible, but that doesn't necessarily translate into the most output.
That's what I mean. So
Yes.
wouldn't it go towards labor inefficiency?
Yes. So I think that's the point he's making here.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I think that's
And that's true. That's true in our society too. Even though we're not, kind of full-on socialist, and I kind of talked about this in my talk last week that we, or did I? Yeah, maybe a little bit. That we tend to use economic policy to create jobs as a way of getting people money, rather than because we need the output of the labor, because we want the product of the labor. So that this kind of speaks to that.
The second part is that in the brackets is that, and what's the point of producing if not to consume? The point of consuming not to derive utility. So he's basically
Right.
saying, what's the point in like maximizing production or labor productivity if it's not generating something that's consumable? Is that kind of?
I think there's 2 points. One is that what's the point of producing stuff if it's not for people to consume, and then what's the point of contributing labor if it's not to produce things for people to consume,
Mhm.
right? So you could argue that contributing labor is actually not productive because we have so much unproductive labor. In that case, it would be what's the point of working if you're not doing it for some benefit? I guess is the main point that he's making. Yeah. Okay. Next one.
Seems right. Yeah.
Yeah. Apologists of capitalism are keen to stress that the rules of the capitalist game provide producers with strong incentives to introduce productivity-enhancing innovations. Indeed, they often force them, if they are to survive at all, to fight off the routine and inertia into which they would sink under a mellower system, and to further develop the productive powers of humankind. If abundance, in some sense, is a key condition for the realization of communism, and if the development of the productive forces as understood above constitutes the way of reaching it, should not a rational pursuer of communism frankly opt for capitalism? Of course, capitalism as such offers no guarantee that the quality of work will be improved, that more and more will be distributed according to needs, or that increased productivity will be reflected in reduced effort rather than in growing output. But, as we shall see shortly, one key institutional change within capitalism could turn such tendencies into endogenous features of the system. What could that change be?
I like this quote. This is my favorite quote so far. Because I think, like you guys were already saying, because I didn't read the article thoroughly, like I'm getting a sense of the cleverness of kind of like where he's going with this.
Yes.
And I also think that I kind of agree in the sense that it seems like one of the reasons we're in a position to talk about the kind of future we're talking about, where most people don't maybe have to do what feels like hard labor most of the time, is because of all the automation and innovation and abundance that has been generated by the system that we have, which obviously is a mix. You always have to have like government regulations and stuff. I'm not saying it's like pure, I don't know what capitalism is supposed to mean here, but these kinds of incentives seem to have played a role in getting us there.
The economy is productive. It's just the benefits are not evenly distributed.
Right, exactly, yeah. So that aspect seems to be successful, like the innovation and the productivity aspect.
I would put a caveat there. I would say the economy is not necessarily as productive as it could be because we're not going to produce what people don't have the money to buy.
Right.
So there is some productive capacity that we're leaving on the table by virtue of people not having money to spend.
But compared to another kind of system that's been tried in the past, at least, it seems like...
I guess I mean like conventional measures of wealth, like, say the United States or other Western European countries and Australia and places like that are considered, I mean, it may not be productive in your definition, but just in,
we're producing more than we ever have before.
Yeah, and sort of, I mean, we've certainly got the means by which we could eradicate a lot of the problems that...
And we're producing more with fewer resources, and we could automate a lot, even that we haven't automated yet. So, I mean, there's a lot that's been successful.
Yeah, and but there's BS jobs that will hamper our ability to...
Yeah, I'm not saying it's optimized at all. I just mean this general idea, seems right.
The idea that you could, I mean, what they're talking about here, of course, is basic income as the key institutional change. But yeah, I mean, once you have a basic income, then it can reduce our incentives as a society to kind of create jobs as a way of getting people money.
Like you're talking about,
Yeah, and that is very kind of anti-socialist too, because socialism is all about labor and getting money from jobs and being, you know, adequately or fairly compensated for your labor, that kind of thing. But yeah, I mean, I think, you know, capitalism on its own, or the market economy on its own, is not going to distribute the economy's output optimally to consumers. It's just not. You know, they have to have money to spend in order to participate as consumers in the market economy, and that's what basic income gets us.
Yeah, socialism is about, well, trade unions arguing on behalf of the workers to get their just benefits or whatever, while trade unions will have a benefit, make an argument that to provide the most labor, you need to not mechanize or automate as much. Like with the longshoremen in, well, everywhere, they don't want to automate their ports because they rather just have more jobs and pay more and take as long as they like to load and unload equipment and whatever.
Yeah, when people need their jobs, they're going to be resistant to those jobs not being around anymore. That's something. So I think, I mean, I think that's right. That's one of the mechanisms of socialism. You know, it's kind of organizing things on behalf of workers and kind of putting everyone into the worker category.
Yeah, and I guess that's one of the downsides of like what we've been talking about, using this worker idea as a way to justify why people should get benefits.
Right.
I mean, this is a little bit tangential, but sort of like, I mean, just going back to the productive capacity economy, and it's, you know, like one of the things that we don't often think about, or like doesn't, you know, is the fact that a lot of the resources have been, you know, kind of appropriated by, you know, big corporations or taken from other groups of people, you know, based on, you know, so there's sort of like, I don't know how that, I think you got to sort of, if you factor those costs into production, you know, like, or you know, indeed, you know, carbon generation, stuff like that, like there's something that, like, I'm not saying it's like, it's sort of orthogonal to basic income per se, but like, if you really measure the productive capacity economy and sort of
internalize the externalities.
Exactly. Yeah. That's where I'm going. Yeah. If you do that, then maybe our wealth will be not quite as big, but there's still no reason not to go for basic income. But I think it's something we might have to like have a different level of basic income than maybe we think about.
Yeah, I think, you know, something like a carbon tax, you know, it reduces the resources that are available to the economy now. So it reduces the level of consumer spending the economy can sustain, and thereby reduces the level of basic income that the economy can sustain. But it's also something that we want, because we want to reduce carbon emissions. So, you know,
it increases potentially economic productivity in the future, right? Because if you don't have catastrophes, then et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah,
so it's kind of like a short-term, long-term thing.
Right. You know, there's the you know, maximum resource extraction, you know, kind of mode we could put the economy in that is not sustainable, and then there's also, you know, like a sustainable basic income with a sustainable economy, and that, you know,
I mean, it certainly helped with the idea that, you know, like you don't have to protect coal jobs anymore. I mean, that would be huge.
There's some benefits
for sure.
For sure.
You know, and you wouldn't have as many politicians who were then trying to defend those coal jobs because, you know, I mean, I guess there are a fraction of people who might argue that, you know, mining for coal is, you know, it has that, you know, it's, but is it seriously anyone?
Are you trying to say it's manly?
Yeah, you know. I'm not catch me in a coal mine, but this is an argument that's made, though, right?
Yeah.
It's out there. I'm not, you know.
But I bet those arguments would be less popular without the money component, like without doing the job.
Yeah.
You know, I think part of it comes along with the job.
I mean, this is why I love these retraining programs. There was something on the, I think it was on the PBS NewsHour, and they followed some coal miners in Appalachia, and then, you know, had them go through like job retraining programs, and they didn't work because then they went back to coal mining because I mean, obviously it actually paid more, but also there was kind of some sense in which like they felt that was like There's a cultural, so there is a cultural
Yeah.
component of a lot of these things
Yeah.
that are hard to.
It's
and
tough,
and
yeah.
your career being part of your identity.
Yeah.
Yes.
Like
absolutely.
I am a
Yes.
farmer, I am a coal miner.
Yes,
That's like
yes.
what I am
my
as a person.
my
Yeah.
grandparents before me, kind of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It is really hard to change. Like if you've developed like skills and expertise in that area, it's hard to catch up
Right,
in another
right.
area. Yeah, that kind of
I
thing.
mean,
too.
Yang talks about that too.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
I have a question about, and
Yeah.
maybe this is completely off topic in a way, not completely.
If it's about the
because Tim-
quote, it's probably
Tim-
not.
Well,
Yeah.
it can't be completely.
Yeah.
But the idea of the routine and inertia into which they would sink under a mellower system, the idea of it's reminding me about the connection that people have with innovation and capitalism,
Mhm.
and that communist nations are seen as not being as innovative and creative, and they tie that to their system of economy.
Yeah.
And
They
I mean,
lose the market incentives.
right,
Yeah.
but I mean the way this is framed, he's talking about productivity enhancing innovations mostly. I mean to do with capitalism and to do with producing stuff.
Yeah.
But it does raise the issue, and there's two things happening. I mean, if it's basic income, we've talked about creativity being able to be unleashed, if you will, from individuals
Sure.
if they have that. But the economy as a whole, I wonder about. Just in terms of
You're wondering about
the innovation of new companies, new products,
if people
inventions.
are being paid a basic income, there might be less incentive
Less
to
of
innovate
that.
because there's less. It's not like, oh, I need to innovate or I'm not going to survive or something like that.
kind of thing that's
yeah.
going with
So this
capitalism. in
so
some
this is
ways.
related to, remember when we had the discussion about the free rider problem?
Mhm.
So the idea is that you want the incentives in the market to be such that we get a sufficient amount of labor contributed and a sufficient amount of innovation to keep going.
Right.
But you don't want the incentive to work to be so high that people are now being forced to do work that is not necessary.
Or quote unquote innovations that aren't helpful, I guess, too, right?
Right.
Start companies
Right.
that don't need to be there.
So the idea is you want to get the basic income to the level such that it's not, so that you're not under incentivizing work, but you're not over incentivizing it either. And that's true of, innovation falls in that category. And a lot of the,
In a category of work?
Like something you don't want to under incentivize.
you don't want to under incentivize
or
innovation.
over incentivize.
But I think it's important to keep in mind that a lot of the most important innovations of humanity, like some of them were part of, a lot of them came from war and defense,
Yeah.
contracts and all of that.
Right.
But a lot of the most important innovations of humanity came from work that nobody ever would have thought to pay for.
Right.
It was rich people who had the freedom to think creatively and spend their time doing what they want.
The gentleman
Um,
scientists. And
So I don't think it's the case that the German scientist. I don't think it's the case that the achievable level of basic income is zero. We don't know what it is, right? There's a level of basic income where you can set it too high and then you're not getting enough work done.
Right.
And maybe you're actually getting more innovation done, but you're not getting enough
Or
ordinary
there's different
labor
kinds
done.
of
that
innovation
kind of thing.
too. Like I think you're talking about like very fundamental intellectual innovations, mostly maybe.
Or development of technologies.
Yeah, that kind of thing.
research,
But there's
yeah.
also just like small but incremental innovations within like how to run a company,
Yeah.
how to make the product.
Right.
And I think
Right.
of that in terms of like the capitalist incentives kind of
Yeah,
driving
people
that
find patents
to-
all the time in
So-
companies, and but I'm also thinking about it in a broader sense
Yeah.
in terms of nations. I mean,
Right.
there is a stereotype of
So all of this just goes into factoring into what level of basic income the economy can sustain, right? It's not about basic income or no basic income. The level of basic income we achieve is partly going to be determined by what are people's motivations, what are their intrinsic motivations, and like how much do you need to provide a monetary incentive for various different things, right?
my intuition is that it would actually spur innovation because there'd be
Yeah.
a lot of people who, would like to do
Free to do stuff,
free
yeah.
to do stuff, so start companies. A lot of kind of the way it works now is in order to be involved in creating these, everyone says you got to go work for Google or something like that. But
Right.
if you're
Yeah.
working for Google basically owns everything you do.
inventions, yeah.
And it doesn't really free you, and then they tie people up in non-compete clauses and all this
Right.
sort of stuff. And so,
Right.
because it's like it sort of pushes people to work in big institutions.
So that's my intuition too, and my intuition is that when we, once we calibrate basic income to the highest level, the constraining, force there is going to be: are we going to have enough labor going into like ordinary labor going into the economy. What are our physical resources that are available for production, that kind of thing. My sense is that it's not going to stop because we're getting to the point where people aren't innovating enough. I would imagine that even once we get to the highest sustainable basic income, if you could move it higher, there'd be even more innovation.
But
Yeah.
I guess there's also the question of investment with
Yeah.
respect to innovation, like in terms of starting new companies.
No, this is the same thing, right?
But I mean, you've also talked about how you want to look at the like interest rates and make sure there's enough investment.
Right.
as well.
Yeah. So private investment in the economy, people starting businesses, starting new ventures, that kind of thing. I would say that kind of falls into a similar way of thinking as innovation in general. Like, what are people going to kind of go off and do on their own? If we set the interest rates too high, then if someone has a really great idea, they're not
won't
going to be
get
able to
funded,
borrow
right?
money and turn that into something, right? So that's kind of, we'd probably look more at the interest rates constraining innovative developments than we would at kind of people's intrinsic motivation.
And I guess
Yeah.
investment is an aspect of capitalism that you would maintain, like, I don't know if he's
That you would
maintaining it,
maintain?
that you would maintain in your future.
Oh, sure. So
And
they-
Alex
He might
Howell's
not. Yeah.
ideal utopian society.
Yeah.
they talk about growth in this article. So growth
Yeah.
is all about, or largely about investment. What capacity are we building in our economy, that kind of thing. But yeah, I would want to maintain that. So we're getting short on time, so I want to get through some of these quotes kind of as quickly as possible because there's some stuff at the end I want to get to.
Okay.
But there is another directly ethical way of justifying socialism against capitalism, not as a more effective way of getting somewhere else, but as intrinsically more just and therefore better than capitalism. After all, as pointed out earlier, it follows from the very definition of ideal socialism that it abolishes exploitation. One may therefore expect exploitation to be much less present, if at all, in actual socialism than in any version of capitalism we may dream of. And this in itself may suffice to justify our preference for socialism over capitalism, especially when one realizes that communism only constitutes the notional and unreachable end of a transition that is bound to drag on forever, even under the most favorable circumstances. Even if capitalism could take us more safely or faster in the direction of communism, therefore, it may still be wise to choose socialism because choosing capitalism would have the intolerable implication that exploitation would be with us forever. And I think, this is certainly a reasonable argument that could be made. I think it's right that communism is something that we would never achieve, no matter how we're trying to go about it. But I think it's also true that basic income solves this problem.
Of exploitation.
In the capitalist framework. So.
Do you want to go to the next one?
Yeah.
It's like Nick's asymptotic, right?
Right.
In a way.
Yeah.
How you were thinking that, Nick?
Yeah. I mean, there's still going to be profit, so maybe in the technical Marxist definition of exploitation, it's still going to be there, but everyone's going to be really happy and, prosperous and everything. So who cares? And people are going to feel like they're spending their time how they want and they're being paid to do the things.
And the
that
profit
they
is
want.
supposedly for related to the benefit of the people, like I could say.
I mean, the profit is just, that's primarily an incentive for the businesses to produce what they're producing.
That's
that
what I
kind of
mean,
thing.
yeah. Exactly.
So here they're talking about a make-up guaranteed income, that's where you kind of top people off.
Wage subsidy type of thing.
Not exactly a wage subsidy, but you top people up to kind of a minimum subsistence level, and if you're getting paid, you don't get the make-up guaranteed income. So the key point is that a make-up guaranteed income, whereby transfer payments are added to income from other sources up to the level of the guaranteed income, not only stigmatizes all those who live off benefits, it also unavoidably imposes a minimum wage. No one will accept a job, even a job one would much like to do, though not for nothing, for less than the guaranteed income, because accepting it would mean becoming financially worse off than one would be without working, due to the cost of childcare, of transport to and from work, etc.
Yeah, that's interesting.
So this, I highlighted this one because it reminds me of the idea of a federal jobs guarantee. So if you take a federal jobs guarantee and you just say anything you do counts as work, then what it is it's exactly this. It's a make-up guaranteed income. And this is even if you take out the jobs part, this is still the problem with.
It's like the benefits cliff kind of thing. It's the same kind of, not quite the same, but it's the same dynamic.
Yeah, it's less of a cliff. It's more like you wouldn't work for below a certain level.
There's some
threshold
effect.
Exactly. That's exactly right. So this is, even if you take out the jobs part of the jobs guarantee, this is the problem providing income in that way, like only to people who aren't getting income from other sources. People could volunteer, or people could earn, the minimum wage or higher, but then anything in between, all that potential, like what if Bethany wants to do something interesting, for, $3 a day or something like that, that kind of thing is not going to be able to exist in the economy. So yeah. If, on the other hand, guaranteed income takes the form of a universal grant, unconditionally awarded to every citizen, things are different indeed, because citizens have an absolute right to this grant, whatever their income from other sources. They start earning additional net income as soon as they do any work, however little and however poorly paid it may be. Mm-hmm. So I think that's exactly what I was talking about. Consequently, if communism is to be approached within a capitalist society, it must be by way of raising as much as possible the guaranteed income in the form of a universal grant. Note that this maximization could be conceived in either absolute or relative terms. Maximizing the guaranteed income in absolute terms could be justified on the basis of John Rawls' well-known difference principle. It would amount to eliminating all income inequalities that are not required if the least advantaged, here defined to be those who have no income in cash or kind apart from the guaranteed minimum, are to be as well off as possible. Such an elegant way of combining the imperatives of equality and efficiency may seem attractive to many, but it does not coincide with the Marxian objective of abolishing alienation, which implies instead, at least as a first approximation, that the guaranteed income should be maximized in relative terms. Communism is achieved when the whole social product is distributed irrespective of each person's contribution, not when the share each gets, irrespective of his contribution, reaches some absolute threshold. So this kind of Rawlsian approach to basic income is usually what I'm talking about, maximizing the level of basic income based on what the economy can sustain. The more Marxian version is the idea that instead of making the poorest person as well off as possible, you want to maximize the extent to which everyone's equal. Everyone's getting the same out of the economy. Pretty straightforward.
Yeah.
When those two things converge, that's when you get communism, maybe.
Well,
potentially.
They're saying
like
that
an idealized version of communism.
That's when you get like the best. That's a better communism than if you lower the basic income in order to make it more equal.
Right.
Yeah. This gets a little bit tricky because, as we'll get into in a second, they're talking about funding basic income through taxes, so that if you get to higher taxes, then it brings the people at the top down, et cetera, et cetera. So they're kind
there's
of combining
complicated relationships.
Yes,
Yeah.
We'll get to that in a second. We do not believe that advanced capitalist countries have achieved anything like abundance in this strong sense required for the implementation of full communism. But we do believe that they have achieved abundance in the weaker sense specified above. They could grant each of their members a sustainable universal grant, though not necessarily a sustainable make-up guaranteed income that would be sufficient to cover his or her fundamental needs. Of course, such a claim, once made precise, what are fundamental needs, can only be established by informed simulation and actual experiments. It is not the purpose of this article to undertake the important task of assessing this empirical claim. If you're going to go for the full-out communist approach, making everyone as equal as possible, that potentially brings the level of basic income down because you're taxing money from the rich. Even if you're not using the taxes to fund the basic income, you want to punish rich people as much as possible. You want to take away as much of their money as possible to achieve as much equality as possible, right? That lowers the level of basic income the economy can sustain. But you have a certain limit, and they talk about this elsewhere in the article, you have a certain limit where you wouldn't want to lower the basic income below that limit. And that's kind of like the fundamental needs idea. So you have to have some calculation of what people's fundamental needs are. Obviously, I would argue that we should maximize the basic income, so regardless of what fundamental needs are, it doesn't change the highest sustainable level of basic income the economy can handle.
Which could even theoretically be lower, though you don't believe that it is.
It could be lower than someone's notion of what people's basic needs are. You don't know until you try it.
My basic needs include yachts.
You need yachts?
Yeah.
Oh.
No, I'm just
Well, it
joking.
depends how many yachts.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
Apparently, billionaires
Yeah.
cannot have too many yachts. It's like
How could one not have a yacht? I mean, how do you get across the sea?
So I actually want to start drawing the diagram here. Yeah. So this is.
oh, the laughing curve.
Yeah, it's hilarious. And then. G, and then you've got like. And then. I don't know what. I think this is like. Y1. Y.
It's y and y prime, so y
Y.
on the bottom and y prime on the top.
Okay. Cool. So basically, the way they're thinking about basic income is that it's all funded by taxes. That's a T. And the idea with the Laffer curve is that if you don't tax anyone at all, you don't get any tax revenue. If you tax, this could be like 0% income taxation, and this could be 100% income taxation. If you tax 100%, then there's not going to be any economic activity, so you don't get any
Y
tax
should go
revenue.
to 0.
And Y should go to 0. Actually, that's right. Yeah. So the idea here is that if you wanted to maximize the basic income, it would be here. If you have your kind of minimum subsistence level across here, then you could set taxes at this level and get that level of basic income.
So what's the y-axis again? The dollar amount.
The y-axis is the kind of the dollar amount of the G is for grant, I guess. Is that consistent with your guys' diagrams there? Thanks for printing that out. So I want to read this quote. The Laffer curve of supply-side economics provides us with an effective, though oversimplified, device for depicting the range of choices open to society. For a given technology, a given pattern of individual preferences between income and leisure, and a given potential labor force, one can picture both the amount of effort elicited from the population and, consequently, the total product as decreasing functions of the tax rate, supposed to be uniform. On the other hand, total receipts, which are given by the total product multiplied by the tax rate, and coincide, to keep things simple, with the part of the total product distributed in the form of a universal grant, first increase and then decrease as the tax rate rises. Note, however, that the total product or income we are talking about here only corresponds to the taxable product or income. So this here is the taxable product or income. And then this is stuff like people are just doing things that benefit other people or themselves. It's not something you can really tax. It's not part of the taxable economy. So Y is the taxable product of the economy.
Oh, the product is.
Does
Yeah.
Y1 also include like the black market or something?
It includes the black market. It includes Y plus everything else.
So remind me, what's the first curve? And that's the Laffer curve, right?
This
This
guy is the Laffer curve.
And what's the other one again? The top one? And
So this is the product, the total product of the economy. So as the taxes go up, the total product of the economy goes down.
The taxable part.
So this is the taxable
Yeah,
product.
Y is the taxable one, Y1 is the total. So
Y1 is Y prime is the total. Yeah. So that's the basic idea. And then on the next quote, will help us.
so the y prime is basically the sum of those two curves.
Y prime, is it the sum? I don't know if it's exact. No.
The difference between y and y prime is just all the non-taxable.
Right.
Yeah.
That's right.
But I think as more people have universal basic income and they don't need to work for income, they're able to do a lot more things by themselves, like home producing things or things that they do amongst each other, that is still a product, something is still being produced, but it's not taxable.
So, a policy that gives a guaranteed income for all a high priority could be guided by at least 4 distinct principles. It could attempt 1, to maximize the total product both actual and taxable, under the constraint that the universal grant should reach a given minimum level. So this is the growth-oriented criterion, and this is here, right? Because you're maximizing. It's the minimum amount of basic income that will get you to, or the minimum amount of tax that will get you to subsistence basic income. Therefore, you're only docking the total social product by the minimum amount. So that's the first one. And then the second one is the Rawlsian one. So that's to maximize the absolute level of the universal grant. So that's this one here, which I already drew. The third one is to maximize the relative level of the universal grant as a proportion of total taxable income, which amounts, under our assumption, to maximizing the tax rate under the constraint that its absolute level should not fall below some given minimum level. This is the Marxian criterion. So this is over here. So notice that the basic income is the same here and here. It's just the total product is lower here, so the richest people are less rich.
And I guess you're growing less for the future or something like that? Is that part of this?
You are probably growing less for the future as well. You might, be growing.
There's a fourth one, right?
Right. So the fourth one, to maximize equality as approximated by the ratio of the universal grant to the actual total product. Subject again to the not necessarily binding constraint that the universal grant does not fall below some minimum level. So depending on this curve up here, this could be anywhere between 3 and 2. It could be somewhere in here. Because here you have, and maybe this isn't steep enough, but here you have, this is dropping off and this is staying a little bit higher. So if you're doing it as a proportion of y prime instead of a proportion of y, then it would be somewhere in here. So that's basically what this is describing.
And the horizontal dotted line, that's just an arbitrarily defined subsistence level.
That's your arbitrarily defined subsistence level, basic needs, that kind of thing. So I think, for me, I typically talk about this one here, the Rawlsian basic income. Well, yeah. So I typically talk about the Rawlsian one, and then also, we do want a certain level of growth potential for the future as well. So what you might do is you might actually keep it a little bit lower. So this is one they don't talk about in the article, but it's probably, I'd put it somewhere in here so that the basic income is still really high, but you have, a good amount of growth for the future because that benefits everyone in the future.
The Yangian basic income.
I don't know if I'd call it a Yangian basic income. I think the Yangian basic income is more this one, like they're trying to achieve a subsistence level, like get people out of poverty and then stop, that kind of thing. Maybe it would go higher later. The main objection I have to this is that we're taxing. I don't think that's necessary. Obviously, if we're not taxing at all, then you lose the whole Marxian effect because you're not taking anything away from the rich, at least with respect to taxes. But what I would do is I would do something like this. I know we're running out of time here, but you'd have your grant here, and then what you have over here is interest rates. So this is the interest rates in the financial sector, and then the level of basic income, goes up and up and up until you get to the point where it's not going up any further. But as a consequence, the basic income going up doesn't correspond with the total product going down. It corresponds with the total product also going up until it kind of levels off when you get to the maximum level of basic income the economy can sustain. I don't want to draw what's to the right of these things because I think it gets a little bit messy and complicated. But once you get to the point where your basic income is no longer where you increase interest rates and it no longer allows you to have a higher basic income, or you increase the basic income and it's no longer allowing more output in the economy, then you're kind of getting to the limit of what the economy can sustain.
You're going to get inflation.
You're going to get inflation, or maybe interest rates are higher, so the basic income starts having to go down, and maybe you get to a point where interest rates normally contract the financial sector and help prevent inflation. But if interest rates are really, really high, then you can imagine that anyone who has any money anywhere can just lend it to the government and get a ton of money back. And then that starts becoming inflationary as well. So the constraint here is that we're only doing what's possible given a current price level, and then once you get inflation, you'd have a period of inflation until the economy started working again, and the basic income was lower in real terms.
Is it the case in your model that as you increasing the interest rates is the way that the government's able to sort of quote unquote print the money to fund the basic income, right? Is that
it reigns in the financial sector.
Right.
I would say that generally speaking, when you start the basic income, I think it's hard to say whether you would need higher interest rates to counteract it, at least at first, because you're maybe activating capacity, and the changing shape of the aggregate demand curve would actually create an incentive for producers to keep prices lower and produce higher quantities, like all on its own, even without raising interest rates. But eventually you get to a point where you start needing to raise interest rates to keep prices stable in the presence of basic income.
If you do it that way, isn't it maybe by necessity or indirectly, you're going to find that you maybe don't have as many billionaires and like outsized wealth in that sense?
You might find that, yes, very much so. Because if they're making all their money in financial markets and stock markets and everything like that,
where all the wealth is being
of that. If all of that evaporates, then maybe no more billionaires.
Maybe that's equivalent to smashing capitalism in some sense. Without actually having to smash it.
It might be equivalent to what people are thinking of when they talk about smashing capitalism.
Yeah, that's kind of
yeah. But yeah, I mean, this like in this world, you're not going to be able to make much profit just by investing in investments and like that kind of thing. The way to make profit is to produce things for consumers. So even if people are getting rich in this world, they actually are doing it because they're providing something useful.
There's less of a rentier type economic models, the things that are based on extracting rents from.
Yeah. So I think this is the big thing that they get wrong in their article, which is the whole compensating for or aligning the basic income with taxes, that those two things have to line up and that it's all funded by taxes. And this is something that I think Philippe von Parijs still gets wrong today. This is a tricky thing because people are apprehensive about taxes.
Is this his model? He's still kind of more or less. Is he got? That was 86.
I mean, I think it's pretty much the same.
What's in his recent book? There's a section in the recent book that's very similar.
Yeah, I think it's
like this figure is the same.
Yeah, and that book is from 2 years ago.
Book. Yeah.
It's called Basic Income: How to Something Radical Society and Free Sane Economy.
Never finished it.
Radical proposal for a free and sane. But it's basically the same stuff. I think this is, in terms of the people, the biggest thinkers in basic income, this is the change they need to make. They need to start thinking about what is the maximum achievable level of basic income, and then you can start thinking about, well, how do changes in taxes affect what the maximum level of basic income is? Depending on the tax, the basic income could go down. If it's a carbon tax, then the economy's productive capacity goes down. That's a lower basic income. If it's some other tax that helps us use resources more efficiently, then that might result in a higher basic income. But it's not one-to-one, dollar for dollar.
And it could be agnostic with respect to how you feel about growth in the economy in the sort of sense of material output. It doesn't require constant economic growth per se, right?
No, not at all. Yeah, I mean, you could have whatever the economy's capacity is, you can activate that capacity efficiently using a basic income, whether the economy is growing, staying the same, or shrinking. The basic income, of course, would have to adjust to match whatever the economy is capable of doing. But that's it.
If you're listening to this, Philippe,
yes,
come over here and
come and
fight us.
Yeah.
Prove us wrong.
Come fight us. The gauntlets have been thrown down.
Collaborate.
All right. So we're over time. I just wanted to get into this stuff because it's important. Does anyone have any kind of first of all, any questions about this to kind of clear it up beyond what we've already done?
I think we should do a quick go around. Final thoughts from people. All right, if you guys don't mind sitting here. I'll be really quick. I thought this was super interesting, and I was really excited to see more of the article and what his arguments were.
I liked something with a figure in it. But seriously, my curiosity is really drawn toward imagining kind of the effects on the culture as this wider range of options is opened up for people. And I mean, I think there are some things about that I am kind of apprehensive about. It's inspiring me to maybe propose some topics for future sessions.
Cool.
Good idea.
All right.
Yeah, very interesting. Thanks. You said we didn't have to know economics, though.
I just explained it to you.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Go ahead, Alex.
Yeah, well, this is fun. I mean, I want to go back and read the whole paper properly because I think it seems like I like the way it's set up very rigorously, and they kind of like break out these different conditions, and it's kind of good to see that all. I'm actually interested. It's amazing that this is 30 years ago or something.
Yeah.
They kind of like got a lot of the stuff we're talking about now.
Yep.
So yeah, cool.
Yeah, I thought it was a really, really interesting article, and I'm just curious, as I talk to more people about it, what their reaction is to going from using capitalism to get to communism, and see what their reaction is.
I feel like I understand parts of the article better having gone through this conversation, so that was helpful.
Yeah.
Well, we didn't get to how the Ferengi.
That's because of the spoiler. We'll have to talk about it later.
I didn't hear it.
We're talking about a
no,
30-year-old
we're
TV show, aren't we?
Yeah.
We're watching it now.
We're watching it now.
Yeah.
Oh, we're
so,
going through from the
Going through
beginning.
Deep Space
Yeah.
Nine, through the whole thing.
So Michael says, so would any taxation be required to prevent inflation with the UBI? So the way I like to think about UBI is that there's a certain level of UBI the economy can sustain without inflation. And depending on the tax, that might increase or decrease that sustainable inflation-free level of UBI. So that's it. This is a great discussion, you guys. Next week we are going to be on Tuesday, and we're talking about retirement. How are people? Why do we save for retirement? Is it still going to be a thing if we have a basic income?
What if
That
we
kind of thing.
don't?
Right.
This was
Yeah.
I think something that I kind of mentioned. Then you beat me to it by getting that article.
Yeah.
Which is
Oh
cool.
yeah,
So-
and your anecdote about retirement that we were talking
Right.
about.
So Alex
Yeah.
suggested the topic,
Oh, good.
and Richard sent
it.
me the article
Found
a
the
few months
paper,
ago.
actually.
Oh really?
Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah.
It means I don't have to.
All right.
Thank you, Alex.
Thanks,
Excellent.
Thank
Nice to meet you all.